The torches flickered low in the corridors of Whitehall Palace. Outside, snow gently blanketed the rooftops of London. But inside the royal bedchamber, death was already dripping through the walls. The air was thick, sour, almost alive. Those who entered the king's chamber winced, not from fear of power, but from the overwhelming stench of human rot. Henry VIII, once the proud, muscular monarch who commanded the loyalty of a nation and the fear of the church, now lay on his vast, custom-made bed, his bloated body leaking infection from open sores. The legs, once capable of jousting like a warrior, were now swollen to monstrous proportions, wrapped in foul-smelling bandages soaked with pus. Beneath the linen, the skin had blackened. Gangrene had set in. His attendants came only when summoned, and even then reluctantly. It was not just the physical sight that horrified them, it was the feeling. The sense that this was no longer just a dying king, but a man being punished by something divine. The scent of death clung to everything: curtains, tapestries, even the crucifix hanging over the bed. One servant later wrote that the king's body gave off a vapor as if it were already buried. But he never dared write that publicly. In Tudor England, even whispering that the monarch was dying could be considered treason. So they smiled, they bowed, and they pretended not to smell the decay creeping out from beneath the royal sheets. Sometimes, the king would murmur names in his sleep, names of his dead wives, names of his enemies, names of men he had once laughed with and later sent to the axe. But most often he said Jane, Jane Seymour, the one wife you loved, the one who gave him a son and died for it. His mind was slipping. His body had already begun to collapse in on itself. An ulcer on his leg had never healed, and by now it had grown so deep that it was said you could see the bone beneath. The surgeons applied poultices, herbs, even wine-soaked cloths, but nothing helped. The leg oozed, bled, and stank. The smell of it filled the room like a curse. The king's face had changed. Once considered handsome, now it was round, sagging, pockmarked with pain. His eyes darted about like a trapped animal's. Some claimed he saw visions, ghosts of the women he betrayed. Anne Boleyn, the second wife, whose eyes he could never quite forget, even after her beheading. Others said he spoke to shadows, called out to long-dead figures in hallucinations. He no longer trusted anyone. Even his food was tested for poison, though no one would dare assassinate a man who was already dying from within. His way had become legendary. His bed had to be reinforced with iron bars. He was so heavy that when he tried to walk, his attendants had to carry him, 4 men on each side, straining under his bulk. And yet, through it all, no one dared speak the truth. The king is not dying, they said. He is merely unwell. Even as the smell of decomposition filled the palace, even as the physicians whispered to each other that he might not live the week, English law forbade anyone from predicting the monarch's death, so they played their roles in this grim theater. The king lay rotting, and they smiled through the horror. Then came the night that changed everything. It was bitterly cold, and the wind howled through the narrow windows of the chapel at Sion Abbey, where Henry's coffin would briefly rest before burial. The embalming had been rushed. The body had not been properly sealed, and so, as it lay inside the coffin, gases began to build. Fluids pooled in the crevices. The coffin, already straining under the weight of its royal occupant, cracked slightly. In the darkness of that night, something seeped out. Black cadaveric fluid trickled from the coffin and dripped onto the stone floor. It smelled foul, earthy, rancid, unnatural, and it didn't go unnoticed. A pack of stray dogs, somehow loose within the abbey grounds, found their way into the chapel. They licked the liquid. They howled. One monk later wrote that the scene was like something out of the Book of Revelation. He dared not speak of it for years, but the story spread, whispered behind closed doors. The dogs licked the king. The image haunted them, not just because of the grotesque nature of it, but because of the symbolism. The mighty Lion of England, reduced to a leaking sack of rotting meat. This wasn't just a man dying. This was a kingdom watching its god-king dissolve into human flesh. They tried to clean the floor. They resealed the coffin. But nothing could undo what had happened. In the eyes of many, it was a sign, a curse, a judgment. Some even said that Anne Boleyn's ghost had cursed him in her final breath. that the blood of innocent wives had finally come for him. When the funeral procession began weeks later, the coffin had to be carried quickly, for the smell had become unbearable. Inside, what was left of Henry was a collapsed ruin, a body bloated with gases, disfigured by sores, a grotesque parody of the golden prince he had once been. But no one would speak of it. They sang hymns, they read scripture, they called him Henry the Great. And yet, those who had walked past his bed in those final days, who had breathed the same air, would never forget what it felt like to be in the presence of death before. Death had claimed him, because what died in that bed was not just a man. It was a myth, a vision of royal invincibility, the illusion that power could protect a man from the slow, inevitable ruin of the flesh. Henry VIII ruled like a god, but in the end, he died like a man, and worse, he rotted while still alive. He was born on a warm summer morning, June 28, 1491, in the grand halls of Greenwich Palace. From the very start, Henry Tudor embodied something more than royalty. He was a vision. Tall, athletic, with fiery red golden hair and a confident smile, he could command a room the moment he entered. His father, King Henry VII, watched with pride as his elder son, Arthur, trained. A tragedy struck, and soon Arthur's death made young Henry the new heir. From that point on, the boy's future was set in motion. Henry's youth was shaped by a world teeming with opportunity. England was hungry for change, weary of war, and eager for strong leadership. The young prince received an education fit for a Renaissance king: Latin, theology, music, falconry, hand-to-hand combat, even dancing and courtly manners. Yet it was his presence that left the deepest impression. Noblemen and ambassadors spoke of a prince bursting with promise, one whose stride was like a ruler awakening. Venetian ambassador later wrote of him, "Is in beauty sometimes even beyond his youth, a most matchless grace." Praise spread like wildfire across Europe. Henry's early years were more than privilege, they were transformation. By adolescence, he was already a symbol of triumph. He performed expertly on the jousting field, icicle strong in the lists, breaking lances and cheers. He hunted boar and stag with ease, displaying his physical prowess. He also had words. His speech was sharp, quick, and captivating. That mixture of strength and intellect made him irresistible. Courtiers adored him. Diplomats praised him. Scholars admired him. Henry was not just heir, he was the future dot in the public's mind. The prince was almost mythic. Songs were sung about his glory. Poets dedicated lines to his noble deeds. He represented England's hopes, a strong young lion, ready to lead his nation into a new age. It was during this time that Henry's father, Henry VII, began to grant him more responsibilities, leading councils, receiving ambassadors, even managing small territorial negotiations. At the age of 18, Henry was not just prepared, he was performing like a king. The pressure of expectation shaped him, but did not crush him. Instead, it polished him. At age 20, he married Catherine of Aragon, a Spanish princess admired for her dignity and devotion. Their union marked a powerful alliance. She became his trusted partner, supporting him as he navigated the corridors of power. The couple was youthful, their wedding celebrated across England as the dawn of a new era. It was on April 21, 1509, his 20th birthday, that Henry VIII ascended the throne. He stood before his court in sumptuous royal robes and a bright crown, his youth and energy sparking hope and excitement. Nobody knew then how dramatically his reign would unfold. But in that moment, he appeared unstoppable. The coronation pageant was the stuff of legend pageantry. Music, fireworks, and the cheers of thousands flooded the streets. England believed it had found its new shining star. Rule was not just ceremonial for Henry. Dived in with full force, put on massive feasts, sponsored extravagant tournaments, lavished attention on the arts, funded new ships to build a navy, forging his image as a leader of innovation rather than tradition. Surrounded himself with brilliant minds, Thomas Wolsey and Thomas More, powerful church figures who admired his vision. Though he inherited a cautious, money-conscious monarchy, Henry turned it bold and ambitious. Over the next decade, his popularity soared. He was generous to knights, generous to artists, generous to churches. He gave, and the people loved him. Back, King was living homage to the Renaissance ideal, an all-rounded, brilliant ruler. He embodied the dream of Renaissance monarchy, courageous, refined, and cultured. His red hair was spoken of like fire lighting the nation's future. Laugh echoed through banquet halls as though the joy of England itself. But behind the scenes, darker notes crept in. Some courtiers whispered about his temper, how easily he could flare at a minor insult. Thomas More once joked that Henry possessed too much soul that could slip into rage. Others noted how easily he could be swayed, not always by advice, but by whims. And yet, most overlooked these early signs of volatility, trusting that this was a young man still working out his power. His first years as king saw significant achievements. He revived England's royal authority over foreign policy, challenging France and Scotland. He bred alliances with European powers, slowly shifting the balance of power on the continent. He passed financial reforms to fund his navy, setting the stage for later maritime strength. But more importantly, he won the hearts of his people. Every entry he made into London announced his rule anew. The country's new king was unbreakable, full of life, and ready to change England forever. He was handsome, witty, and unpredictable, but also smart enough to command loyalty. His charisma wasn't just a mask, it was the foundation of his reign. When Henry spoke, people listened, not because they feared him, but because they believed in him. His court became a center of cultural activity. Music, literature, architecture all blossomed under his patronage. The Renaissance in England began in Henry's court, and yet, fate is unpredictable. Even as he rose, the first harbinger of his downfall emerged, the lack of a male heir. Catherine gave him a daughter, Mary, but the king's dream was of a strong son, someone to succeed him. When his brother's health declined, Henry's pressure ratcheted up. Doubt crept in for Henry. The world could change only if his bloodline continued strong and certain. But for now, those pressures remained subtle, almost invisible under the glow of his youthful triumph. He continued to ride, feast, speak, laugh with plans for the future that seemed limitless. The legend of Henry VIII reached its peak, a potent mix of Renaissance brilliance and regal legacy. That was the world he had built for himself, a world where he was admired as a hero, loved as a champion, and respected as a wise monarch. A world where kings were immortal, until illness tore through his dream like a silent storm dot in the early years of Henry's reign. It was almost impossible to imagine that this dazzling monarch would one day descend into rot and madness. He was England's golden hope, the embodiment of strength, intellect, and royal dignity. Wherever he rode, a parade of armored knights followed. Wherever he walked, musicians, artists, and poets sang his praises. His court wasn't just a government, it was a spectacle, a living dream of what a Renaissance kingdom could be. Henry VIII believed deeply in kingship as divine destiny. To him, power wasn't just a crown worn, it was a birthright blessed by heaven. That belief shaped everything he did. He saw himself not merely as a ruler of men, but as a chosen figure, a king by the will of God, placed on earth to elevate England above all nations. The early 1510s were filled with conquest and ambition. Henry waged bold campaigns against France, eager to revive the glory of English arms. He wanted victories not just for land or politics. He wanted history to remember his name with the same reverence as Henry V at the Battle of the Spurs in 1513. English troops routed the French, and Henry's image as a warrior king was sealed. But even in victory, he craved more land, more praise, more legacy. Back home, his marriage with Catherine of Aragon was under pressure. While they shared a warm beginning, Catherine's failure to produce a surviving male heir soon turned from disappointment to obsession. She suffered multiple miscarriages and infant deaths. Their only surviving child was a daughter, Mary. In Henry's eyes, it wasn't enough. He wanted a son, a legacy, a future king who would inherit the world he was building. Still, outwardly, Henry remained radiant. He dressed in fine velvets and gold-threaded fabrics. His banquets were so lavish they became the talk of Europe. Wine flowed like rivers. Dancers, jesters, acrobats, and musicians filled his chambers. Foreign dignitaries reported back to their courts that No prince has been seen more splendid nor more feared than King Henry of England. He played the lute, he sang, he composed music, he wrote love letters, verses, and even theological texts. He was not only a king but a Renaissance man. His love for courtly display was matched only by his love for intellectual debate. He prided himself on being a defender of the faith, even writing a treatise against Martin Luther in defense of Catholic orthodoxy, a move that earned him that very title from the Pope himself. He was not only respected, he was adored, but cracks were beginning to form beneath the surface. Despite his strength, Henry's belief in divine favor began to shake as Catherine's womb remained barren of sons. He took it as a sign. Perhaps God was displeased with the marriage. Perhaps something was wrong at the very root of his royal lineage. It was a terrifying thought for a man who believed in destiny. And then came Anne Boleyn. Anne wasn't like other women at court. She was sharp, mysterious, and unwilling to be seduced. While others bowed, Anne challenged. She teased him, pushed him, withheld herself. Henry fell into obsession, not just lust, but hunger for something new, something powerful. Anne became more than a woman to him. She became the promise of rebirth. A new queen, a new union, a new heir. But there was a problem. Catherine was still alive. Divorce, in the eyes of the Catholic Church, was no simple matter. And Henry, the defender of the faith, now found himself at odds with the very Pope, who had praised him. It began as a private struggle for love and succession, turned into a national crisis. Henry demanded an annulment. Rome refused. Years of negotiations failed. Catherine remained firm. Pope stood his ground. So Henry did the unthinkable. In one of the most dramatic acts in English history. Broke from the Roman Catholic Church, declared himself head of the Church of England, and seized religious power for the crown. This was more than political strategy. It was transformation. A king who once fought for the Church now tore it apart for love, legacy, and control. The move shocked Europe. It scandalized Christendom. Friends became enemies. Cardinals were dismissed. Bishops were executed. Even Thomas More, Henry's former confidant and Lord Chancellor, was beheaded for refusing to accept Henry's new religious authority. The cost of Henry's obsession was high, not just in blood, but in the soul of England itself. But in Henry's eyes, it was destiny. Had Anne now. They were married in secret. Soon, she was pregnant. Waited, desperate, praying for the birth of a son. Day arrived. Child was born, a daughter. Her name was Elizabeth. Henry was devastated. He refused. Give up. And too, lost multiple pregnancies. Stress grew unbearable. Whispers of witchcraft, betrayal, and infidelity spread across the court. Anne's boldness, once her greatest strength, became her fatal flaw. Just 3 years after marrying her, Henry accused Anne of adultery, incest, and treason. She was arrested, imprisoned, and executed by sword. Body buried in a graveyard beneath the Tower of London. Queen, gone like a shadow. And yet, child she bore, Elizabeth, would one day be remembered as one of the greatest monarchs in English history. Henry wasn't thinking about that. He moved on quickly, marrying Jane Seymour, a woman of quiet grace and traditional virtue. She gave him what no one else could, a son, Edward. Finally, Henry's vision of legacy was complete. Jane died shortly after childbirth. By then, Henry had aged beyond his years. Stress, the guilt, the wars, the religious schism, it all left scars. He had now buried 2 wives, alienated Europe, and sacrificed centuries of religious unity. In his eyes, it was worth it. His name would live on. Blood would cool. His early reign, once filled with songs, strength, and Renaissance wonder, had now become a storm of danger, betrayal, and blood. And still, the worst was yet to come. The day Henry VIII fell from his horse during the grand jousting tournament at Greenwich in January 1536 was meant to be spectacle and celebration. Crowds filled the stands, tents whipped in the cold wind. The king was to demonstrate his unmatched strength before his nobles. Instead, in a heartbeat, everything changed. The horse stumbled, its legs splayed, and the king crashed to muddy ground. A hush fell over the crowd. One moment power walked the field. Next it lay broken. Henry was carried away. His strong leg racked with pain sharper than he had ever felt. Just at Whitehall Palace brought no relief. Physicians bandaged him and whispered indecipherable reassurances. Beneath the linen wrappings, his leg wound festered, turning black and foul. Infection grew like a living thing, an enemy creeping through his flesh. Began as an accident became the opening of a dark chapter. The king tried to maintain regal posture, continued to hold court, discuss politics, attend ceremonies. With every step, he limped. Once celebrated stride that symbolized his ascending kingdom was now a painful shuffle. Courtiers exchanged anxious looks. No one dared to say anything. Tudor England, to mention the king's weakness was an unthinkable betrayal. As the wound deepened, so did his inner turmoil. The king, once confident and assured, faltered. Sleep came in restless fits. Days blurred into nights of agony. The pain transformed into paranoia. He suspected conspiracies. He feared poison. He demanded that his meals be tasted first, that wines be sampled, that even his posture seated, standing be monitored for signs of deceit. The physical wound became a wound in his mind, unraveling the clarity of a once sharp ruler. Years before, Henry had shattered the authority of the Pope, dethroned the Church, and declared himself head of the Church of England. He beheaded figures like Thomas More and Bishop Fisher. He had challenged high nobility and made them bend to his will. But none of these acts had broken him as this wound did. In the quiet of his bedchamber, the king's power collapsed inward. His doctors lost confidence. His advisors became fearful. Even the structure of power he built trembled. This fracture between physical affliction and psychological collapse deepened in the months that followed. In public, he wore his usual finery, velvet robes, jeweled collars, gold chains. He looked like the king they loved. But behind closed doors, he raged at servants, wept at shadows, lashed out at those he once trusted. In the palace, rumors became dangerous words. One missed curtsy, one gentle snicker, could be twisted into proof of conspiracy. The tension was so thick you could hold a knife in it. Then came the first of many violent outbursts. Men sat down to dinner, anticipating a conversation, but they received suspicion. Henry, having misinterpreted a glance between two lords as a plot, stormed from his seat. He overturned goblets rich with wine, silenced all instruments of music, and demanded that every man's loyalty be declared, again and again. His once joyful banquet hall turned into a tribunal. This new Henry could not trust, even within the warmth of his own castle. It was around this time, too, that Henry's health began to fluctuate dramatically. Fevers came and went. Weight surged and fell. He gained dozens of pounds, his face swelling, with fluid and flush, obscuring the confident visage of his youth. Those who witnessed the transformation in private described a bloated monster where once stood a handsome king. Outside, his image remained carefully curated. Inside, the body betrayed him. This brutal irony, public strength, private collapse echoed through every level of royal life. Nobles who once basked in his favor now studied his every move, ready to flee should his illness kill him first. This fear of premature succession led conspiracies not of rebellion, but of survival. A dead king was safer than a living tyrant haunted by paranoia. As pain turned to rage, Henry's cruelty deepened. He began to punish or let punish on impulse. If a servant offended him, they were thrown into the tower. If a noble bored him, they were banished. Before long, a court once alive with creativity and learning dissolved into a dead hush of fear. The man who had championed the arts now created an environment of oppression. Worse, someone close began to sense Henry's fragility, and that person was his wife Catherine Parr. She had approached Henry in his final years with grace, seeking to soothe his suffering. She was pious, caring, and most importantly, politically cautious. The two became close enough that rumors of inappropriate affection began to spread. Henry noticed. He tightened his guard. He demanded loyalty affirmations. Catherine obeyed, but it was a contract signed in fear, not in trust. In these years, as the physical decline deepened, Henry experienced bouts of visionary distress. He claimed he heard singing in the corridors when no one was there, or voices pleading. Shadows appeared on tapestries that flickered with motion, though no breeze moved the air. Nightmares haunted his sleep. He woke screaming in agony. He became convinced he was being judged by God, by his dead wives, maybe by his own conscience. The scale of fear had grown larger than any battlefield he had ever commanded. Every visit by a foreign ambassador became a high-stakes event. The French envoy might kneel only to rise again at Henry's glare. The Spanish ambassador would look unimpressed, only to be rebuffed violently. England, once expanding through trade and diplomacy, found itself isolated. Even as Henry protected his legacy through decrees, he pushed allies away through fear and instability. Henry's once passionate desire for a male heir had been fulfilled with the birth of Edward. But that joy was clouded by the loss of Jane Seymour soon after. Her death devastated him. She had been quiet, devoted, and unlike Anne Boleyn, she had not defied him. Her passing was a blow not just to his heart, but to the last stable anchor of his sanity. Without her, Henry's capacity to cope unraveled further. By late 1536, the wound had ossified into a permanent feature of his body. His leg refused to heal. Surrounding tissue succumbed to lymphatic failure. His mobility dwindled. He could walk only a few steps before collapsing in pain. Wheelchairs and pulleys replaced horses. Ceremonial entrances were eliminated for simple arrivals. The image of royalty turned into an image of a suffering man. In rooms where once he held court, there were now whispers. Whisper of the smell. Whisper of the swollen flesh. Whisper of the 1,000 pounds worth of jewels he wore to hide the shame of his body. He became a prisoner in his own palace, held captive not by others, but by his own failing flesh. And with suffering came an obsession with control. He rewrote parts of his will, drew new succession maps. His conversations turned to how to outlive those around him, to ensure Edward's safety. He began signing execution warrants for nobles he suspected, including some he once favored. A king who had once dreamed of building great cathedrals and navy fleets now devoted himself to death lists. He ordered the execution of Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey, grandson of the Duke of Norfolk, a noble once dear to him. It happened in January of 1547, just days before his own death. Henry had Surrey beheaded on charges of treason, charges widely seen as fabricated. Yet in Henry's fracturing mind, this was necessary preemptive justice. No one was safe. No one was loyal, especially the ones closest. And in that smoke of paranoia, power, and physical decline, the real turning point was not a fall or a single action. It was the moment Henry chose cruelty over relief, mistrust over mercy, death over healing. That is when falling from a horse changed not only his leg, but also his destiny. That is when a king became a tyrant, nearing his own funeral. From that day forward, Henry VIII was no longer treasured prince or benevolent king. He was a man unraveling, a legend slowly collapsing under the weight of his own power. Reign of hope had ended. Reign of decay had begun. Pall settled over the king's final years like the dusk of a dying sun. Once vibrant monarch had become a hollowed shell of regal power. His body was rotting from the inside, his mind unraveling under the weight of agony and isolation. Every breath was a struggle, every movement a battle. It began with his swelling legs. The priest's proverb, "Come to life," was once the foundation of a warrior king, had become a grotesque landscape of open sores and infected ulcers. Skin around the wounds was blackened and tight, stretched like old leather. The flesh breathed a slow, exhaling stench that wrapped around the room and seeped into robes, curtains, even the hair of anyone daring to enter. No ointment, bandage, or costly salve could stem the tide of infection. Night after night, attendants shifted the king's massive form in bed, wincing with each move as the stench intensified. They said that one had to endure 20 steps through corridor just to enter the bedchamber. Still faint as soon as the door closed behind them, flesh became riddled with gangrene. Fingers and toes seemed to shrink and blacken, as though the poison was eating him away. Living corpse. Every sense, he continued to reign, yet the one thing he craved most, physical autonomy, had abandoned him. Pain surged through his body with cruel intensity. He would clasp his chest, would scream in his sleep. Chambers echoed with moans. It was no longer a court. It was a torture chamber. Alongside the physical torment came crushing mental deterioration. King, once so cunning, was now prey to fearful whispers in half-lit corridors. Night, he walked feverish among the bed curtains, staring at the tapestries as though he expected them to shift and threaten him. He muttered, "They come for me," speaking in a hushed tone that trembled with terror. He recalled events and people long dead, accused long-standing servants of betrayal. He interrogated nobles at dinner, slapping a hand on the table, demanding confession of unseen sins. Thrown into dungeons for a careless word, some courtiers lived in terror of the king's next suspicion. Under his rule, fear became a material presence, touchable, choking, corrosive. The castle atmosphere turned bleak. No spring song from court musicians could mask the stench. No artist's brush could depict the king's golden youth now stained. Agony. Visitors avoided his presence. Guest lists dwindled. Religious processions passed by quickly or avoided the area altogether. Even Catherine Parr, once consort and confidant, maintained her presence carefully, her prayers whispered, her consolations measured. She held him one day as he was shaking in agony, and he wept not just from physical pain, but from the recognition that he was losing everything. His palate devolved. At first the king still tried to taste his meals, but eventually he rejected even wine. His physicians offered broths or boiled porridge, but often he pushed the bowl away in disgust. He feared poisoning, though no bloodhound could sniff the truth, yet there was always someone sent to taste the food first. The king who once consumed feasts of roasted boar, stuffed pheasant, and quarts of wine now nibbled bland liquids with suspicion. His body weight fluctuated. He would swell one season, then deflate into frailty. Those around him labeled it the feast and famine of illness. Rich pudges 1 week, sallow cheeks the next. A pumped crown barely hid the bloated flesh beneath. Holes began to appear in his favorite garments. Pawed layers of velvet were patched together to disguise the rot. Cryptic notes in his chamber journal spoke of no rest, no respite, no God. These words cut sharp. They spoke of a sinking soul more than an infected flesh. And there were the visions. They came cloaked in shadows. On some nights, courtiers heard his voice in moans and mutters. "You think me a coward. You think me gone. Jane," over and over. Some heard him beg forgiveness from God or from the dead. One chronicler wrote, "He called upon them as though his whole life depended on their mercy." Even those outside his inner circle heard his night cries. Carried through secret stairways, sleep became a distant memory. He lay awake for hours, hearing the crackle in the fire, the drip of water from leaky ceilings, the strained breath of attendants in the next room. He would pull himself upright, bathe in cold sweat, and whisper, "Do you see them? Are they gone?" His mind played tricks. Straight lines in tapestries turned to faces. Court laughter turned to mocking echoes. He was trapped in his body and in his palace, haunted by illusions and nursing wounds he could no longer cover. His vanity suffered too. Once proud of his golden beard and red hair, he now hid under dark velvet hats. He insisted on being seen, only in certain light. Criticism of his appearance was no longer tolerated. One courtier barely dared to clean his royal wash basin after a bath, for fear of fainting. Another bought fresh linen just to line the chair he would sit upon, linen that might be burned if stained. This obsession with hiding decay became a ritual of denial. During council meetings, he sat quietly while Thomas Cranmer, or Duke of Norfolk, spoke. He stared at the tapestries, nodding or frowning. Occasionally he would interject, but that was rare. He often signed documents without looking, his hand shaking. He once attempted to hold a quill. His fingers had grown stiff, and he cursed and tossed it across the room. A comical scene that would have been humiliating had it not been so tragic. The king's medical team changed as sickness spread. Physicians arrived, went, and were replaced, none able to heal the rot. Some recommended bloodletting or leeches, others herbs or prayers, but remedies brought more pain. One doctor applied a slug of boiling wine to his leg, filling the room with steam and acidic stench. The king screamed for a minute before going silent. He never spoke of it again. He began to fear his healers more than his soldiers. They no longer represented care, they symbolized torture. His spiritual life swung from desperation to disillusionment. He would pray in the chapel, attend sermons waiting for salvation. Then, during other hours, he would pace halls cursing the clergy for lies. He objected to Protestant preachers saying he had denied Rome. He objected to Catholics claiming he was heretical. He hated them both for their beliefs and their audacity. Few weddings or births or public celebrations marked these years. The kingdom held its breath as power itself rotted. Merchants whispered that the king had become a symbol of England's decay. Nobles feared the economy, suspecting that illness in the throne meant stagnation in trade and revenue. Foreign emissaries crept in and out, avoiding eye contact with the king. Rumors flew that Henry's death was inevitable, and in some distant courts, they toasted his demise. Yet Henry clung to his throne like a barnacle to a rock, refusing to release until the final hour. He scrawled orders for new forts, military alliances, succession plans. His last existing will was written in January 1547. Even in pain and confusion, he tried to organize his kingdom, his body failing, but his throne holding. Toward the end, he spoke of his heirs, muttered praise of Edward, his son, remembered Mary and Elizabeth. He spoke of his ambition before his leg failed. He had planned invasion. Before Jane died, they had mapped trade. Before church fractures, they had intended Catholics and Protestants to coexist. Now he spoke of nothing but will, legacy, mortality, and fear. Chapel at Whitehall saw him kneel every week, wincing in pain. Condolence tokens piled before him. Letter ended with prayers. He, always the strategist, still attested, "The realm shall not collapse. I will stand." It was the last defiant mask of a man ravaged by flesh and mind. 4 servants stood by his bedside. One night in January 1547, when he awoke shakily, he grasped their hands not in greeting, but as if needing support. He said nothing, but his expression read, "I cannot linger." Then he laid back, breath shallowing, eyes glazing in the candlelight. The room smelled of latrine, sweat, and fungi. Above it, an echo of power-soft final royalty waiting to fade. His final night came on a bitterly cold evening. In January 1547, the biting wind rattled the palace windows and candle flames trembled against the darkness. Inside the private chamber, Henry VIII lay motionless, his massive frame unmoving in the heavy bed. His breaths came shallow each one, a soft hiss among the muted silence. Round him, a circle of priests and physicians knelt, heads bowed, searching for signs of life. Some prayed, their lips moving in hushed tones. Others offered ointments, medicated waters, but no one truly believed they could revive him. He lay as close to death as a man could be, without crossing its threshold. Throughout the night the king drifted in and out of consciousness, lost to delirium until a sudden seizure convulsed through his body. Attendants struggled to hold him steady. His limbs jerked with violent intensity. Gasped wide-eyed, his face contorted in pain and fear. Lamps flickered and bounced on walls, casting giant, twisted shadows around the room. Clutched empty space, murmuring apologies to long-dead wives, begging forgiveness, uttering random names with urgency and regret. It sounded less like a prayer and more like a confession from a broken soul. The episode passed. Quiet descended, a terrible, profound quiet, though the entire palace held its breath. Breathing slowed. Pain convulsions emerged. In that moment, even the priests sensed the inevitable. Henry VIII, 55 years old, was dying. At dawn on January 28, 1547, he exhaled his last breath. A candle flame beside his pillow flickered once, and then stood still. His chest no longer rose. His large hands lay limp on the sheets. In the hush, there was no king. There was simply a man, his chest still, his forehead cooled, his face quiet at last. The room remained locked for 3 days. Court, officially silenced by decree, maintained a facade of normalcy. Announcements spoke of the king resting. State affairs continued in carefully worded memoranda. Behind closed doors, panic simmered. Fragile nation waited to see what would come next. Each moment of silence added weight to the rumors. Henry was dead, but no one dared say so out loud. Then came burial preparations. His massive torso required a special coffin wider, reinforced, lined in lead. Mourners reported hearing cracks as they sealed it, sound hidden by hushed voices and prayers. Inside, the body had already begun to decompose, bloated with internal gases, blackened with illness, stiff with rigor, the face distended into a final grimace. Embalmers worked tirelessly scooping out viscera, steeping the chambers in scented herbs to mask rot. Process lasted hours in the freezing cold. Each snip and scrape intended to preserve dignity he had lost in life. Nature would not be thwarted. At Sion Abbey, the body rested in state before a procession to Windsor. The coffin lay open for a few hours so mourners could pay respects. He claimed they fainted. Priests prayed solemnly as masked attendants held fans and perfumed cloths to cover the odor. Chroniclers reported tears, not only for the fallen king, but for the grotesque reality of mortality laid bare before them. Hushed stages, Henry had lost everything: power, beauty, control, revealing the naked fragility of flesh. That first night at church, under the hush of ink-black skies, the coffin betrayed its burden. Now, black fluids seeped from cracks. Wood, pooling in dark rivulets across the stone floor. Scent spread like poison. And, as though summoned by darkness, a pack of stray dogs entered the nave, by church beggars hunting for scraps. Sniffed and licked the leaking fluid, growls echoing against ancient walls. Mrs. gasped and recoiled. Scene became part legend. King consumed so thoroughly that even scavengers claimed their stake. Some saw in it poetic justice. Henry, who had sent nobles into execution and ravaged the church, was now devoured by rot, by nature. The dogs symbolized something darker, a breakdown of divine order, a collapse of fear that he had once commanded. In the days that followed, sermons answered the moment. Devonshire preachers spoke of pride, power, and the cyclical nature of glory and decay. They reminded parishioners that even the greatest must return to dust. In taverns, people whispered, that was Henry the Terrible, not Henry the Great. Children learned to see death even in mightiness, despite the rotting scandal. The funeral procession went ahead on February 16, 1547, with all the pomp of state. Clad horses dragged the coffin through London's silent streets, crowds standing in reverent fear. The clergy chanted soft dirges. Noblemen carried banners and carried on the tradition of monarchy in the face of its downfall. A lavish wax effigy of Henry rode above the coffin, sculpted in the image of his younger, powerful self. It was the kingdom's final illusion of grandeur, a ghost masking decay. Inside Windsor's St. George's Chapel, the procession ended at a tomb beside Jane Seymour. There would be no cries of sovereignty or promises of eternal rulership, just stone, incense, and finality. Henry's body, now cold and weightless inside the coffin, was laid to rest in the shadow of dynastic hope, yet the horror lingered. A month later, palace staff reported an echo, the sound of footsteps, slow, shuffling, across corridors where no one walked. Guards claimed they heard groaning near the chapel door. Some said they saw a pale shape in the moonlight, a staggering figure in crimson robes, stumbling down the stone stairs. Was it a ghost? A dream? Mental projection born of grief and guilt? No one could say. But rumors spread. Henry's spirit haunted the corridors he once ruled with iron fist. In the years to come, royal chroniclers and academics debated what it all meant. Was Henry cursed by divine disfavor, punished for marital carnage, or merely mortal, made answerable to flesh and fate? Symbolic stories grew. Some claimed earth cracked beneath his coffin. Others said birds refused to sing above it. Some believed his spirit transformed into ravens nesting in nearby towers. The myth of Henry's ghost eclipsed the man. And yet, amid the horror, there was history. Parliament met in Edward Seymour's protectorate, moving quickly to cement Edward's succession and erase dangerous memories. That year brought the first English Book of Common Prayer, ushering Protestant reforms. Mary, exiled and bereft, wept in private chapels. Elizabeth, quiet and observant, kept her mother's name alive in letters only. Henry's death was not just the end of a king. It had opened the door to religious wars, civil revolutions, shifts in dynastic power. That Black February marked not only a burial, it marked a turning point for an entire nation. And yet, for those few days when the coffin wept and the dogs drank, It was humanity laid bare, pride, power, pain, and decay all revealed. Even today, historians call it the dark night of Tudor authority, the moment England discovered that no crown could outrun decay. The bones of kings are buried now, but the echoes of that decay, the smell of rot, the shouts of doubt, the silence after death, they remain part of that eternal narrative. Henry VIII ruled with the weight of a god, but he died with the stench of a man. His name once echoed through courts across Europe, feared by popes, bowed to by noblemen, praised by poets. But his body decayed while still on the throne, and his legacy decayed long before the grave closed. This is not just a story about a king's death. It's a warning about power, pride, and the illusion of control. Power is never permanent, and the higher a man climbs, the longer he falls. Henry began as a young, vibrant ruler, a scholar, musician, hunter, and romantic. He was described as England's golden prince. A French ambassador once called him the handsomest man I ever saw. But in the end, that same man was covered in ulcers, grotesquely obese, rotting from within, and terrified of shadows. His public image was carefully crafted, mighty, heroic, God-chosen. But behind palace walls, a private reality was pain, loneliness, and paranoia. The same man who declared himself supreme head of the church died begging God for forgiveness. The same man who dismissed wives and executed friends died surrounded by strangers, frightened and broken. His life teaches us that absolute power corrupts the heart and distorts reality. He believed he could shape morality, rewrite laws, silence heaven, but in the end, even he couldn't command his own body to stop rotting. He could not stop time, could not stop death. Tudor historian David Starkey once said, Henry VIII changed England more than any other monarch before or after him. In the end, England changed him too, into a monster of his own making. That is perhaps the deepest truth of all. Greatness, when unchecked, always bends toward madness. And yet we remember him, not just for who he was, but for what he became. His story endures because it reflects something timeless about humanity. We are obsessed with power, legacy, and immortality, but we forget the body always fails. The mind always breaks. The crown always falls. His 6 wives were not just love stories. They were warnings, each one a mirror of the man's descent. Catherine of Aragon gave him dignity. Anne Boleyn gave him fire. Jane Seymour gave him a son. Anne of Cleves gave him embarrassment. Catherine Howard gave him guilt. Catherine Parr gave him truth. Each one chipped away at the illusion until only horror remained. Still, his face is carved in statues. His name fills history books. His signature, once so mighty, now rests in archives, fragile as parchment. Reminds us that even giants become dust. No amount of wealth, no castle wall, no golden robe can outlast time. Perhaps the greatest irony is that Henry built a church to defy the Pope, to replace spiritual truth with royal will. Yet, at the moment of death, he did not call his nobles. He called his priest, not his council, but his soul. He who claimed God's authority died hoping God would listen. In the years that followed, his son Edward would die young. His daughter Mary would burn Protestants alive. And Elizabeth, his final legacy, would rule in brilliance, but never marry. Tudor line died with her. All that Henry destroyed, all that he built, ended with silence. That is the nature of legacy. It doesn't last, it transforms, and it forgets. But stories do not forget, and that is what keeps us awake. When we look back at Henry VIII, we don't just see a king. We see ourselves, our need to be remembered, our fear of death, our hunger for control, our blindness to consequence. He is not merely a lesson from the past. He is a mirror to the present. He may not wear a crown, may not command armies. Inside every one of us is that same struggle to hold on, to shape the world, be more than flesh. Yet in the end, we all return to silence, to the cold stone, the stillness no throne can protect us from. Henry's story does not end in glory, ends in rot, regret, and ruin. That is why it matters, because the truth, when spoken clearly, hurts. More than any sword, power fades, beauty rots, memory erodes. Even kings are forgotten. The lesson remains forever.